So I am now recording. Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Selena and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is the Brandon Sanderson book tag with my friend Udi, who is here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Udi. I'm a Viking warrior. Greetings.
We are doing the Brandon Sanderson book tag today in honor of the release of Rhythm of War, because when you're seeing this, oh my goodness, because when you're seeing this, it is the release day of Rhythm of War, and so we thought we'd honor that by doing a fun little tag entirely focused on Brandon Sanderson. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the tag. Udi's got the first question.
All right. Brandon wrote many early novels while working as a night clerk at a Provo hotel. What book kept you reading late into the night?
Okay, me? Go? Cool. I know it's the Brandon Sanderson book tag, so it's kind of lame to answer with a Brandon Sanderson book, but I'm going to do it several times. And let's just start off by answering this question with The Way of Kings, because I used to read a lot of books like way late into the night. I just used to do it more often, I guess, but now I don't as much. But this is the last book. Back in March when I read it, I stayed up late finishing this book because I wanted to finish the entirety of part 5 at once, because once you get to part 5, you just have to. And so this is the book that kept me reading later into the night than I normally would have.
Part 4, actually.
Oh, really?
So I don't think I've ever finished a Brandon Sanderson book before midnight. I think I finished all of them after midnight, and I find it hilarious that, gosh, where is it? I find it hilarious that Selena's I read the last 200 pages of The Way of Kings in one sitting when I read the last 500 pages of Words of Radiance in one sitting across a 12-hour period. So that's fun. But actually, I think I read most books late into the night, especially if I'm enjoying them. Most recently, the one that I stayed up way too late reading on the night before an exam is The Fires of Vengeance by Evan Winter, which is the second in the Burning series, the first book of which was The Rage of Dragons. I mean, it was really good. I couldn't stop reading it. I was I'm just gonna read one chapter before I get back to studying, and then I finished the book.
Okay, so question number 2. Brandon's complex magic system set his fantasy apart. What subject do you love to read about in all of its complexity?
For me, that's history. So I've been into history since I was 13 years old. My 7th grade history teacher got me into it. Actually, I was 12 when I started this class. So I was 12 years old when I got really into history. And now I'm 20. So it's been with me for nearly half my life at this point. I spend a large portion of my time just reading random things about history, whether it's in whether it's just going to Wikipedia or reading a history book or watching a history video. So that's what it is for me, history, which is why the Poppy War series is so good for me, because it digs into that complexity of that history often creates.
Okay, I have a couple of them. I really like reading about grief. One of the books that I really liked a lot that dealt with grief was Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kemmerer. And then I also really like reading about parenthood in kind of all of its forms. In a more dark way, The Changeling by Victor Laval really deals with the anxieties of parenthood in a really light horror, dark fantasy sort of way, and that's really cool. A sweeter way that parenthood and family and things like that are done is with The House in the Cerulean Sea. This talks a lot about family and parenthood and what it means to be a family and stuff. And so that was great.
Brandon gets book ideas from watching other storytellers fail to execute a concept well. He figures out how to do it better. What 2 books handle the same concept in strikingly different ways, and which did you prefer?
Okay, so I have a couple actually that I'm just now thinking of. I think that Pet Sematary by Stephen King and The Changeling by Victor Laval, the one I just mentioned when it talks about parenthood, they both talk about the anxieties of parenthood, but I preferred the way The Changeling did it. And then one, using Sanderson again, One that I see as very similar, even though I've never heard anyone else say this, is I feel like the Grisha trilogy and, oh boy, Mistborn, the Grisha trilogy and Mistborn, the original Mistborn trilogy, era 1, they have a lot of similarities in how they deal with religion and idolization and things like that. And I do think that Mistborn explores it better. It explores it in a more complex, deep sort of way. The whole theme of this trilogy like revolves around that in a lot of ways. Like there's a lot here. There's a lot of nuances to it that the Grisha trilogy does not have because it's so focused on your main character and the action and romance around her that the themes that are happening in the wider world is sort of not as important. But in like adult fantasy, since we're not as focused on the sort of YA plot style, those things are explored a lot more. This is a lot longer. He has a lot more room to do it. And so yeah, I prefer this, even though I love both series. I think that this does it better, but they're really similar in like how they do it. Just this is better and more complex and like better.
My answer for this question is also Mistborn, but it's specifically the second book in the Mistborn trilogy. It's The Well of Ascension and a book I recently read called City of Lies. Now, what these two books have in common is that they're both books that follow sieges. So in this one, the heroes are basically like dealing with this siege on their city, and in City of Lies, they're also dealing with the siege on their city. And they're both like trapped inside the city while they're trying to struggle with what's going on outside. But I actually preferred City of Lies' take on the siege. I think overall, Well of Ascension is the better book, right? Because I think Vin is a better constructed character. I think the themes are better explored here. I think the world building overall is better. But I think City of Lies has a better plot in terms of how it handles the siege plot. And overall, I think it's got a better plot because what it does is that it's got the siege going on, but it's also got a closed room murder mystery happening inside of the siege. The characters are trying to solve a murder mystery while also trying to deal with the siege on the outside. It's actually got a lot of what I felt, not necessarily what was missing from Mistborn, but what I wanted more of in Mistborn. But what I wanted more from Mistborn was more like intrigue, more like things happening in back rooms, more like secrets and shadows and stuff. But City of Lies gave me that like really like lots of intrigue, lots of secrets, lots of like clever, intricate plotting going on.
Yeah, those are really similar. I didn't realize how similar they were in plots with that.
They literally have the same plot setup.
Yeah. Number 4, child Brandon was recommended several books about dogs that die. As a result, he became a reluctant reader. Please share a formative, good or bad childhood reading experience. Okay, so you go.
So I actually have 2 of each. So my first bad reading experience was The Mark of Athena by Rick Riordan. That book was the first time I have been completely and absolutely and utterly disappointed with a piece of literature. It was probably the biggest letdown of my life. I don't know if I've really recovered from it. And I recently figured out a good use for that book. I now use it as a fly swatter. Whenever there's a fly in the room, that's all it's good for because it's so thick for no fucking reason. So now whenever there's a fly around, I'll just use it to like smash the fly against the desk or the wall or something.
Good experience?
Okay, so good experience. The first good experience that I'm going to talk about, I think one of the reasons why I was able to get back into reading was actually because we buddy read Mistborn together. I think you might remember, I think it took me 2 months to read the first Mistborn book because it's a slow beginning and I wasn't used to that. And so it took me like 6 weeks to read like the first 150 pages of Mistborn. And then the last 2 weeks I flew through the book and it was fantastic.
Yeah.
I really don't think I would have even gotten that far if I hadn't been buddy reading it with you and you hadn't been saying, it's so good, you have to read it. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll read it. Sure, all right. I also got one of my best friends out of that buddy read. So so us buddy reading Mistborn together was really fun. Yes, that's you. I was like, why is she not smiling? Like, what's going on?
I was like, did you get someone else to read it?
The other bad reading experience that I had, not so much like a reading experience, but I was really into the 39 Clues when I was younger. I was, there were like 3 of those books coming out every year, which I loved. So I was just like picking up every single one of them. And like the first book ended up being like 11 books long. The first series ended up being 11 books long. And then I started the sequel series, which was getting even longer. And then I was about halfway through the sequel series, which by the way, like that's when things start to pick up, right? Like that's when things are moving fast. That's when the intrigue is going. And that's when my mom said, "You're too old for this. And I don't want to keep spending money on the same series over and over and over again. So I'm not going to buy you any more of these." So I just like stopped reading the series in the middle. And it's been like 10 years and I still haven't finished it. And I don't think I'm ever going to, but now I'm always just wondering like, hey, what happened with Dan and Amy? Did they ever beat the Vespers? Like, what's going on there?
And that series was like perfect for you because it has so much history and like it's based off like real stuff that is actually like real places. Yeah.
But my second good reading experience, this series, I've just finished reading this like a couple of months ago. This is the Book of the Ancestor series. This is not the first book. This is the third book. The first book's over there. I don't want to walk to get it. I don't know how to explain this series. It's basically like the short version is that it's assassin training school, but that's a really bad description of what this trilogy is. I guess the way that I would put it, I would do a character pitch, I think. The pitch for this is we follow this girl named Nona who's trained to become an assassin nun, but the real journey here is how she starts in book 1 as this really like optimistic, wide-eyed, idealistic person who believes in things like the power of friendship and stuff. And then over the course of the trilogy, those beliefs, those values, those ideas are tested. The world keeps like trying to destroy her values, trying to make her into the opposite of who she is and what she wants to be and what she wants to believe in, and the types of relationships she wants to have. And she keeps resisting. And it just like gives me a lot of hope because it's like, well, if they can remain like such good friends in the face of such like terrible shit that's going on, then like we can deal with America.
So I'm going to talk about a positive and a negative as well, I think. And I had a lot of positive reading experiences growing up, like a lot of my favorite books. I have one that I haven't talked about before. Like I could easily talk about my favorite book, The Little Prince, but I think I'm gonna talk about something I never talked about before, but I'm gonna go negative first. Okay, so the negative reading experience started out as a positive reading experience. Well, it sort of actually started out with a negative. My 4th grade teacher, when I was 9 years old, was mad that I was reading so many of the like Rainbow Magic, like little fairy books. I'll put a picture on the screen, but they were definitely lower than like my reading level was, but I loved them so much. I could also say those were formative because they were formative. But so basically he wanted me to broaden my horizons and he gave me this series called The City of Ember. I loved the first book. I thought it was great. I liked the second book, not as much, but I still liked it. And then came the third book, The Prophet of Yonwood. So The Prophet of Yonwood also deals with religion, and it is way worse than both Grisha Trilogy and Mistborn, in my opinion. And I am going to be a little bit spoilery for Prophet of Yonwood, so I'm going to put a timestamp below, like right there. And so if you don't want to hear it, skip to that point, and that'll be when I'm talking about my positive experience. Just know I had a negative experience with it. Okay, for those of you who stayed and don't care that I'm going to spoil a part of this book, do you care if I spoil a part of this book, Udi? Okay.
Nope.
Good. So the Prophet of Yonwood is basically about this false prophet that this town of Yonwood was like in love with and listened to everything she said. One of the things that she said in her prophecy state was no dogs or something. And the townspeople who all had their dogs, it was the middle of winter, they like forced everyone to put their dogs out into the cold and into the winter and get rid of their dogs and like send them off into the forest to like die basically because it was the middle of winter and it was so cold and I hated it. I hated that book. I cried for a whole afternoon. I was so upset. Goodness.
That sounds traumatic.
It was traumatic. I literally cried. I literally like went home and shut my door and cried for hours over these dogs. And so it's similar to Brandon Sanderson's. Like people recommended him books that made the dogs died in. I hate to see a dog die. Like literally one of the things that will make me DNF a book is like if a dog is killed in an unfair way by a human. It's happened before. Anyways, so that was a bad reading experience. But the next year in 5th grade, I had a lot of good formative reading experiences. One of them was with I guess Percy Jackson is a really good one. My friend at the time, who was like not a great friend later, one of the great things that she brought to my life was Percy Jackson. So that was amazing. It was the first time I ever loved a book. But I also read this book called Midnight Magic by Avi in class that year. And it was just nothing that it had this boring cover. I'll put a picture of the cover I saw. It looked old and it was like dirty. And I was like, I do not want to read whatever this book is. And I loved it. It was scary for me. I was terrified of because the whole premise is like there's a ghost wandering this castle and you're following this magician and his assistant as they're hired to figure out this ghost. I loved that book so much. The reason why I think it was formative is because I love that stuff now. I love to be scared by a book with a ghost or something like that. And Midnight Magic, it terrified me as a child. I was positive that I saw a green ghost like wandering my halls. I loved it, and I still love like spooky, gothic-y vibe, like gothic books with like that vibe. Yeah, it was formative, probably entirely due to that book. You got question 5.
Right. Brandon and several friends host the Writing Excuses podcast, and they frequently invite guests. Please tell us about a collaborative fiction project and what you thought of it.
Okay, the one I'm going to talk about is Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. It was my first Gaiman and my first Pratchett book. I read it last year, and it was before I was really into adult fiction, but I really, really enjoyed that. It was like a beautiful sort of absurd, but it also deals with a theme that I really like. Honestly, I could have talked about this for a couple of things, like a theme I really like about, like maybe we can be different than what we are supposed to become or what our natures tell us we could become. Good Omens deals with that. The House of the Cerulean Sea deals with that. And I genuinely don't know which one I prefer because I loved them both. It just did so many things that I loved, and it was my introduction to both of those authors. I have since continued on with most of Neil Gaiman's work other than like his comics and stuff. I haven't read any more Pratchett, but I want to. And it was just sort of a seamless collaboration. It was such a collaborative project. Like Pratchett would write something in the morning and then he would send it off to Gaiman and he would wake up at like noon and then just be editing it, and they would send it back and forth. And it was just a really good introduction to both of them. And I highly recommend it. I think it's a great collaboration. One of the collaborations of our time.
Mine would be the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, this isn't exactly what this question is asking for, but like I'm still going to go with this. I did not read a lot in high school. I sort of fell out of love with reading in 9th grade, 10th grade, I believe it was. I sat down and I watched, that's when I first realized, that's when I first learned, oh, all of these Marvel superhero movies are in the same universe? I had no idea. So I sat down that year and I watched the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe all the way through up until Age of Ultron, which was the last one that had come out. The reason why I can count this, and I wouldn't count most movies and TV shows under this umbrella, but I count the Marvel Cinematic Universe is because each individual movie's like, it's got its own unique directorial vision to the point where this is a collaborative fiction project as much as any other that we've seen in literature. Because here you've actually got like the vision of multiple directors coming together to form a larger whole. The reason why I put this one here rather than a book like the original or, other things is during the period that I wasn't reading, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was probably the main form of fiction that occupied my mental space, alongside probably Breaking Bad on the TV side. But like the Marvel Cinematic Universe was definitely like the forefront of like all the fiction that I thought about regularly. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, like it sustained me through pretty much all of high school until I got back into reading in second year of college.
Okay, so number 6, Brandon's first book, White Sand Prime, was rewritten and eventually converted into a graphic novel called White Sand. What book would you like to see in another format?
So for this one, I'm just going to say that I think everything that Brandon Sanderson has written should be produced in animation. In my opinion, particularly by a Japanese anime studio, because I think his books are anime as hell. Like, so a lot of people have talked about how with Mistborn, I don't have the first book, otherwise I'd hold it up. The way the action works, the way the characters talk to each other, like everything about it feels so anime. And I can't explain exactly why, other than the fact that it's very visual. It's pretty fast paced. Also because of the way the characters interact with each other, which is like anime is always really good at this, like really well blending together plot, character, and world, which is something that Sanderson is really good at. The Cosmere and all of Sanderson's books really would be really good as anime.
So I think the Lunar Chronicles would be really great as an animated series. I've always thought Percy Jackson would be really good as an animated series. I kind of want to switch it up a little bit, though, as I was just thinking about it, and say something that I don't think should be adapted into another format, and that's The Giver by Lois Lowry. And this book did get a movie, and it's because, to me, the big reveal of The Giver is ruined if you put it in a visual format because you know it immediately. Whereas, like, when I remember reading The Giver, it took a bit to figure out what the big reveal about the world is, which I won't say here. The Giver is one where I'm like, that adaptation should have never happened. I always like it when authors can use the format that they are in, or like writers of any kind, and put it to best use. I think The Giver does that.
Brandon writes very quickly. What prolific author or authors would you recommend?
Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite authors, if not my favorite. I think he and Sanderson sort of vie for the top spot, but I think Neil Gaiman is such an amazing author.
How prolific is he? Like, how much does he write?
Oh, is that what this question is asking?
My pick for this is going to be Dan Wells. So Dan Wells is a good friend of Brandon Sanderson, but Dan Wells is probably as productive, or well, almost as productive as Sanderson. The only reason to say almost and not as is because even though I think they both release books every single year, Sanderson's books are like 3 times longer. But what I really like about Dan Wells is that everything he writes is so unique compared to everything else he has written. I never feel like I am picking up a book by the same author when I pick up a different series from him or a different book from him. Dan Wells, each time it's like a brand new, fresh experience, as if I'm encountering like a brand new author. And so I think he's a genius in that sense. And he also writes incredibly prolifically. He's definitely my pick.
Number 8, Brandon's Cosmere Universe books are grounded in Platonic philosophy. What book or series gets you really excited about the source material?
Book that has made me very interested in the source material. Actually, let me get it. Book that's made me really interested in the source material is going to be the Powder Mage trilogy by Brian McClellan. This is a really fun trilogy. It's basically the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars in a fantasy setting with a gunpowder-based magic system where these powder mages will snort gunpowder and then they'll get magic powers, right? It's kind of weird, but it's really fun because of how awesome the Powder Mage trilogy was, and how it showed and how it like took from its history-based setting from the Napoleonic Wars, and how it drew on like flintlock guns and the magic that it used and all the politics and stuff. Like all of that made me far more interested in the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars and flintlock weapons. He pulls in a way that makes you want to know more about the setting. And this is one of the few trilogies that I wish was longer than a trilogy, because if I could follow the same characters for a longer amount of time in this world, I'd be happy.
So my answer is going to be several things that with roots in Greek mythology. So when I was a kid, I was a Percy Jackson kid. I love Percy Jackson. And after reading Percy Jackson and blowing through it, I was obsessed with Greek mythology. I would read Greek mythology books cover to cover. And then it was a gateway into like other mythologies and things like that, and reading about those. Even mythologies that Rick Riordan hadn't yet written about, like Norse mythology. I learned all about that. Like, I was obsessed. And then it sort of, dwindled when I wasn't in like middle school. Recently, I wanted to talk about how that love was sort of reignited when I was reading Circe and the Song of Achilles, because both of these books, it felt like reading Percy Jackson, even though they're nothing like Percy Jackson, because of that grounding in Greek mythology, grounding in something that I knew so well, that I loved so much, that I hadn't experienced in a while. And also, I haven't read the Iliad, but I've read the Odyssey, love the Odyssey. Circe takes a lot from the Odyssey, but also just other plays and things, which I've read a lot more of plays and different writings from Greek people now, which I hadn't read as a kid. And so I know more about who the Greeks actually were rather than what their mythology is. I could see so much of that when I was reading Circe and then Song of Achilles, same deal. It got me excited about Greek mythology again, and it made me remember my love for it and remember a time when I was a kid just discovering it for the first time. And no book has been able to do that for me since Percy Jackson. And so I love those for that reason.
Question 9. Brandon loves to show multiple sides of every issue and to contrast character values. Please share a book that handles controversy well.
I'm gonna do an answer that can be pretty expected from me, but Beartown by Frederick Bachman I think is one of the best examples of controversy that I've ever seen. This story follows a town that is a Swedish town that is very reliant on hockey. It doesn't have a lot else going for it, and when a hockey player of the town rapes a girl in the town kind of explodes. There's a lot of controversy and conversation around it, and you follow a lot of different people in this town. You don't just follow the person who was raped. You follow like everybody. You follow like her parents, you follow the boy who did it at times, you follow her friends, and you see lots of different views on what happened. I think that Bachman does this in a really complex and good way. What he's trying to do is show a systemic picture of why this happened, what led to it in this town, what cultures were propped up and who propped them up, who benefits from these cultures. And he weaves this web that shows you how hockey in this small town is connected to the trauma of a young girl.
Did someone say bear?
What? Why?
My pick for this question is going to be The Calculating Stars and the Lady Astronaut books, the Lady Astronaut series as a whole. Basically, the premise is that at the very beginning of the first book, a gigantic meteorite crashes into the eastern seaboard of the United States and wipes out the U.S. government and triggers a major climate crisis. We now see the world's governments coming together to form the International Aerospace Coalition, where they're now going to try to colonize the moon and Mars because they need to get people off the planet in the next 20, 30 years. Otherwise, everyone will die and life as we know it will come to an end. The first thing to note is that it takes place in the 1950s. So the fun part of that is that they have to solve all these problems with 1950s technology, which makes everything 10 times harder. But the really interesting part of this is that because it takes place in the 1950s, so it's alternate history science fiction, we're also dealing with a lot of 1950s type issues. So we're dealing with sexism because the main character is a woman and she is obviously not really she's not really considered for the space program because she's female. Mary Robinette Kowal was asked how did you write 1950s sexism so well? And she was like, honestly, sexism back then isn't that different from sexism today. I found the exploration of that to be really intriguing to me. It's exploring things like racism as well, which I thought was really well done. I think it was better done in the sequel. I think book 1 deals more directly with sexism and book 2 deals more directly with racism. It also deals with mental health stigma because Elma has anxiety, really bad anxiety, and she doesn't want to take medication for it. Something I just pointed this one out before we started. But it also deals with the fact that people don't believe that there's a climate crisis. They're rejecting science. They're rejecting the space program. I thought that was really well done. And so what I like about them is that they explore these really complex issues that hurt a lot of people. And yet things are getting better for the vast majority. This society is becoming a better place for people of all genders and all racial backgrounds and all cultural backgrounds. I really like that because it explores the issues in a nuanced, complex way, but it also has a hopeful theme, which a lot of stories that would have this premise would not have.
So the final question is number 10. Brandon Sanderson is a writing teacher, and unlike some writing teachers, he posts his lectures online for free. What free literature resource are you grateful for? And we're changing the question a little bit so that we can include not just free literature resources, but free resources that we've encountered that have expanded our ability to interact with reading and fandom and things like that. So yes, take it away, Udi.
So for me, I have a bunch of answers for this, but I'm going to start with not Goodreads. Now, to be fair, I'm kind of addicted to Goodreads, but it's also terrible. and so I never want to give it any credit. I think the two things that have really like done this for me are one, BookTube. I think Murphy Napier's channel, Daniel Green's channel, and Selena's channel have enhanced the way that I interact with books, because I think they've really made that process a lot more fun. AuthorTube as well, I think, because I'm a writer, has enhanced my way of reading, because whenever AuthorTubers talk about like ways to look at writing, it helps me see books differently, and it helps me interact with the reading community as well. For a similar reason, r/fantasy on Reddit has been really good for me in that way, because they're like where BookTube allows me to learn a lot of things and interact in small ways, really, because it's really just comments that I'm interacting with, and I'm really getting like other people's perspectives on BookTube, right? With r/fantasy, I can actually give my perspective and engage in like long, drawn out debates and arguments, and sometimes fights.
Theorizing.
But there's a lot of fun with it, because I get to talk about books I like. I get to recommend books to people, which is always so much fun. So I think r/fantasy, because of how I get to engage with the community. And of course, there's the theorizing on the Brandon Sanderson subreddits. I love going there and just like talking.
So my free resources where I love to read are the two that I mainly use are LibriVox and Libby. So Libby's a library app where you need a library card. You can put that in and you can get your library's like collection of audiobooks and ebooks. And it's a really great resource. I love it. I have listened to most of my audiobooks that I've ever listened to from there. And then I also, LibriVox is a service that I've talked about a number of times. It's like a public library. You don't need a card for it or anything. It's basically an online app where there's like lots of volunteer narrators who narrate a lot of books in the public domain. So a lot of classics have multiple versions of people who voluntarily narrated these books just on the app that you can access for free at the tip of your fingertips. I love LibriVox. I'm about to start listening to the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes on that. But I also just, my main platform that I talk about books on is BookTube, and I'm very, very grateful for BookTube. It is the thing that got me back into reading. I was not reading for many, many years. I love this platform, and it has drastically, drastically improved my life, and I am so glad to be engaging with it this past year. Thanks. Okay, that was a nice ending. Other thoughts you want to say before I do the outro?
All hail to Branderson
Oh
for his masterful storytelling, his perfect world building, his amazingness, for blessing our lives.
So this has been the Brandon Sanderson book tag. We hope that you have enjoyed listening to us talk about these questions and rant about some books we love. If you want to do this tag, consider yourself tagged by both me and Udi, and you can either, make a video yourself, tag us in it, or you can just do questions in the comments, whatever you want, talk about some of your favorite Brandon Sanderson books or other books. Thank you for coming on my channel, Udi. This has been fun.
You're welcome.
A good tag. Thank you for suggesting it. Thank you for watching this video. We will see you in the next video that Udi is in, because Udi will undoubtedly be back, and I will see you next time. Bye.
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 I saw your left hand there. That's gonna like get you demonetized, Selena. Yes, good.